Hello, I'm John Thomas Richards, professor of English. I teach at Columbia College, Fort Leonard Wood, and I am here to tell you a little about the SORRAT experiments and the Cox-Calvin RSPK automatic filming device experiments, which are a part of SORRAT. Now, in 1959, I met John G. Neihardt, Poet Laureate of Plain States of the United States and Poet Laureate of Nebraska. Dr. Neihardt introduced me to the SORRAT concept, Society for Research on Rapport and Telekinesis. I'm going to skip a great many of the details, but SORRAT was formed in September 1961 at Skyrim Farm near Columbia, Missouri. This was Dr. Neihardt's home. He made me one of the original members of this group, and my job was largely to record any phenomena which might take place. Now, Dr. Neihardt's idea in forming SORRAT was to see if he could replicate the phenomena, the physical paranormal phenomena which took place during many 19th century experiments and apparently was no longer taking place, chiefly because no one seemed to be running experiments to find out about these things. Now, things were being done which he did not know about, but we thought at the time that SORRAT was the only group of its sort. Now, in the fall of 1961, we began getting some minor physical phenomena, raps and slight vibrations of tables. By the spring of 1962, there were gross movements of physical objects. We would sit around a table in the usual sort of seance circle, and we would attempt to simply accept whatever happened. We weren't striving to get something to happen. Wasn't a mental effort involved at all. We were just seeing what would happen, and many things did happen. Now, I'm going to skip over the intervening years because gradually things got increasingly strong with the physical phenomena. In the mid-1960s, Dr. Neihardt contacted his old friend from the 1930s, Dr. Joseph Banks Rhine, the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man in Durham, North Carolina. Rhine made suggestions for making observation boxes and other things that would provide an atmosphere for contained PK movements, psychokinetic movements of target objects. Next step involved William Edward Cox. Now, Dr. Rhine sent Mr. Cox out to Missouri to work with the SORRAT group. He eventually, with the help of his assistant, Steve Calvin, built what he referred to as the Cox-Calvin RSPK, recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, filming device, and hooked it through micro switches to a mini lab box, a transparent container with micro switches inside a container which could be securely locked and sealed and still allow some of this unusual psychokinetic activity to take place in a controlled environment. Now, Cox had discovered, as we all had, at Skyrim during the experiments there, that the experiments themselves did not require people sitting around in a circle trying to get something to happen. We had assumed earlier that our minds would be what was controlling it, but apparently this wasn't true. It happened whether anyone was present or not. Well, this meant that either you sat around 24 hours a day observing, or you figured out some way to record what did happen when it took place. With Cox's mini lab, we were able to place target objects, designated target objects, on micro switches, and then at any time of the day or night when any PK did take place, the camera would automatically start when the micro switch was tripped, a timer would run, the camera would run for a certain amount of time, and it would capture this on film with lights and camera going on automatically. Therefore, the people involved could go about other things. We'd still run the regular sessions, the experiments, but and there do many other experimental tests which I won't go into, but the mini lab itself would capture automatically what took place.
My name is William Edward Cox, and I have appointed myself to be an investigator of the phenomena that have been going on for years in Rolla and in Skyrim near Columbia, Missouri. I've been very interested in psychical research, for well over 50 years. Got into it through magic as a magician, and that has put me in good stead in many ways because I can use the skills that are developed there to accommodate myself in investigating all manners of the paranormal. Clairvoyance, precognition, mind over matter, psychokinesis as it is now called. It used to be called telekinesis, and it is that which has drawn me to the state of Missouri where I now live. And I've been researching with Dr. Tom Richards for 10 years now. But my interests stem from being not only a magician, but having such an interest in psychical research that when I moved to North Carolina in '32, I learned of Dr. Ryan, who had just started his laboratory a few years earlier at Duke University, and I began to associate with him. And after World War II, in which I served only briefly, I began contributing to his journal and then devoting more and more of my time to his work in statistical evidence for ESP, and particularly psychokinesis, in which I was immensely interested. And that's what I have been doing on a scholarly view with statistical scientific evidence that is pretty dull in the lab for years. But then I'm augmenting it now with the most unusual opportunity ever that I've heard of in this field, namely close-up investigation with camera of physical phenomena that are inexplicable.
What made you, and you're a graduate engineer, experienced magician, world-famous parapsychologist, what made you to the creative inspiration of the mini-lab? A way of trapping this, filming it, having a record that everyone could peruse and make their minds up.
This was the idea of Dr. J.B. Ryan, the head of the Parapsychology Laboratory, Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man, and for half a century head of that famous lab at Duke University. And there was one of these little glass boxes that had been made by one of our members, donors, that were right there in Durham, North Carolina. And they, the idea originally was hers, but Dr. Ryan suggested to me, make a mini lab, just make a box, well-secured glass box, so that you can lock it up and make it portable, and you will really have a little laboratory. And it made sense, so I promptly made one. And on my next visit out to Missouri, I took it along. It was about a cubic foot, and of all plexiglass except the bottom, which was a glass mirror. It had a shelf in it and a few other trinkets in there, and a couple of little locks on top that were cheap. But I retained the keys to those locks at all times, and yet things did happen in that box. A few things, not too many. although the box was loose and you could have faked a little bit, you could have stuck a piece of paper with something written on it through the crack in the top, because the box was not as skillfully made as my later ones. But that's our first mini-lab. And it sits up at Skyrim right now. It's been up there for years, waiting for something to happen. But nothing has. And the next mini-lab was an aquarium tank, which I made after moving here in Rolla. Just putting it on wood, binding it with steel, a 1-inch wide steel strap that went around it, and the holes in the end of it were locked with a adequate padlock, tight, so tight you couldn't possibly get the bottom wood off. Now the bottom wood is bottom because the aquarium tank is upside down upon it, and it is bound by having the steel strap go through a couple of holes, slots in the wooden base. And everything I put in there are viable targets, whatever I think of putting in there, anything. And my 3 switches of electrical contacts were put in there at the same time so that it could start the camera. We were experienced with a camera because before I made my second mini-lab with switches, the thing I brought from Durham didn't have switches in it, it was just a glass box, plexiglass. But when I put this second one in place, got phenomena, we had already tested a camera that Steve Calvin, a graduate student of chemical engineering at the University of Missouri here in Rolla, who was my formal full-time assistant whenever I needed him. I employed his services to start with. And he was very helpful, and one of the things, not only did he furnish the camera and an electrical relay system for triggering the camera whenever a switch inside of this new mini-lab was thrown, but he did various other things, including the lens arrangement and the accurate sharpness of it and the lights. Anyhow, we had the trick to where the little switches in the mini-lab would start the camera whenever anything disrupted. And that's how we began to get our formal tests after we had done some original ones of laying a pencil on top of a little cradle, hoping that the pencil, when it lifted off the cradle, would break the electrical connection and we would see it flying. We did. We didn't see it right, but we saw it rolling about in its sheep fashion until one day when it rose up gradually, went out of sight into the air beyond the view of the camera. And it was then that I decided to make a new mini-lab to replace my old one with switches. And that's when we began to get good, viable, proofable inside information. The camera. We have some phenomena that puzzle me, that will amuse the critics, like this one. That's when I just now said my pencil rose, jumped, got out of view of the camera from its little cradle without any mini-lab around it in the early days. What do you reckon I later found when I later on, much later on, re-examined that sequence of film? Only 3 or 4 frames of film viewed the pen after it had left the cradle and was standing on its vertical leg. It didn't write anything, it just stood there for an instant and then went on up. There was a white thread stretched from it right down to the bottom of the exposed area of the film frame. And it's clearly there on all 3 successive images. Now what does that mean? I don't know. It happened once again later on. But if that implies fraud, which to my mind it does not, you would have to explain a ton of other stuff by similar method, including plenty of other writing of pens in which there was no string attached.
And such an assortment of phenomena. You mentioned a direct writing. You briefly touched on the rings. What are the things, a brief catalog of the type of phenomena you've seen, recorded?
It is too wide for me to
You've
announce.
had sorting of beans, different colored beans, coins, on command?
Oh, yes.
Were you told, Tom, or a written message to that effect inside the mini lab or in the isolation room?
Yes. Inside the mini lab, I have laid them, and the beans would be assorted, or the little rice grains, some of which were colored black, would be assorted into the other little tray. They couldn't be seen by the camera, though, they're too small.
Sorting of cards, spontaneous combustion?
Oh, sure. Exactly 30 totally different types
30 different
of phenomena
What is the common
that I have had experience. Now, many more than that have occurred to Skyrim, but the Skyrim phenomena occur without any scientific safeguards against fraud and accuracy.
Do you see any correlations with place in the building, time of day, presence of people, absence of people, jazzed up feelings, whatever?
No, not particularly.
Random times, nighttime, daytime?
Not particularly, not as much as I should hope.
Nothing outstanding, no sore thumb sticking out. Aha.
No, none yet.
Yeah.
I haven't had any opportunity to put electroencephalographic tests on Tom, nor do I have the time and equipment to do it with. That can be done by someone else who replicates these phenomena. Another thing, various other things should be done. He could be given various tests. He isn't particularly interested isn't desirous of having those tests anyway.
What is that anyway, that fancy Rube Goldberg had Cox device?
Well, this is a smaller model that was made. Originally, this was the first model, but then I made a larger model with more than 2 electrical switches within. This one has only a couple of switches, and outside shorting switches are here for necessary reasons. But this larger model of a bigger aquarium tank served better. And then one day, Yorkshire Television of England, who had learned about us, insisted on filming this for the Arthur C. Clarke series, The World of, what was the title of that book now? Anyway, Arthur C. Clarke's World of Strange Powers. And that series of 13 weeks long featured one of them on psychokinesis, and this box was featured in it. The locksmith hired by me earlier on for my own benefit to do an excellent job of tying up the big original mini lab, and I told him that I was a magician, which happened to be true, and gave him that excuse for my wanting him to lock it up well. And I said I would pay him for his time, and he had better not fail to do a good job, and please don't put any writing pen or pencil inside it. Well, he did as I asked, and he laid a sheet of blank paper in there, and in 3 days I came back to his locksmith's shop with writing on that paper and a pen within, and he about fell through the ground. We looked at it outside of his shop on a little card table. He looked at the lock and swore that his lock was perfect. Then I took my blanket off of the mini lab and showed him what was in it, and he didn't know what to think. He thought it was all electrical. Well, of course he did. Now this box is a smaller one that he successfully did an excellent job of locking up for Yorkshire Television. These coins down here were laid by me inside on 8 little receptacles within, with the hopes that they would vanish and go into on the table. Well, actually only 1 was found on the table. The remaining 7 were shipped off by mail to 7 different members of the community, 7 people I know, some of whom were SORRAT members, like Apoff and McClenon and others. These coins thus, one of them went to Arthur C. Clarke. In fact, it went into Arthur C. Clarke's home through a letter that was placed in here by Yorkshire. The Yorkshire Authority, Mr. Adam Hart Davis, who was the director of the filming crew, put a letter which was typewritten on the spot by his stenographer and secretary, typewriter and all, in my backyard where they filmed the whole business. And it was addressed with an ordinary amount of stamps, but it vanished from here. As you see, it is no longer here. You also can see that these 2 locks are absolutely, genuinely secure. They have jammed key on the interior, and a tissue paper glued on top of that with super glue by the paid locksmith, and he has signed it with his name. Both of them are still there, and there's not a way in the world normally that you can open this and get in. But paranormally, it was no problem. The letter did vanish, and it went through the mails to Mr. Arthur C. Clarke in Sri Lanka. It was received by him with a couple of foreign stamps slapped on it, from what source we do not know. I know that it wasn't any hanky-panky because the hanky-pankiest would first have to open this pair of locks that I've just shown you and get in there and remove the letter. And there's the enigma.
This is the tank, which is fit on top of a solid base. The base has grooves into which the tank fits. The base cannot be slid sideways. The band goes around the mini lab under the base. The only break in the band is at this point. The lock, you'll notice, is a combination lock, is preset by the experimenter only. No one else in the group would know the combination. In addition, Cox also used special string through the hole so that in the band, so that the string could be melted, and then a notary public seal placed over the string to provide extra sealing. Inside the mini lab there are micro switches on which target objects are set. A timer would set off lights and a camera. Once an event had occurred, a switch could be turned off, still leaving other micro switches ready to be triggered by other events. There are, as you see, 6 switches. These are connected to the micro switches inside, enabling all or only a few to be used at one time. I'd like to show some of the films that were made by the mini lab beginning in 1979 and ending in 1981. Switch is being tested now. A tank has been placed over a pencil. The machine was triggered by the pencil moving off of the micro switch. Now you can see the pencil on the micro switch, then off of the micro switch as it is now, and you can see it move slightly under the tank that's simply placed over the board. It is not strapped down at this point. You can see a slight movement of the pencil, but no writing at this time. The bell in the corner is not being rung either. There's another slight movement from the pencil. Now, in this version you can see that the pendula are swinging desperately. Here the band has been placed around the mini lab and it has been locked, and the clock shows real-time passage. Now you can see Ed Cox putting a string around the lock at the top of the mini lab and melting the string. He will then put his notary seal on top of this. Now, you notice in this one that a pin has erected itself inside the box and is marking. His first messages were very crude, but it's going off slightly in the coffee. Very slightly, and there is a vibratory activity. The box appears to be shaking rather than any particular thing happening inside the box. Now you can see Ed Cox fastening the box together at the beginning of this sequence. Shows what has happened inside the box. 4 leather rings. Now watch those rings very carefully. small marker clock is going around 1 revolution every second, show real time. The name John King, or J. King, has been written by the pen, and you'll notice that the cube has made a serpentine motion through the coffee grounds. Now the cube has jumped on top of a film canister. The canister contains a small amount of unexposed film, which, when it was developed, was shown to have radiation effects. You can see it move across the front of the mini-lab. The cube moving from the micro switch in the rear is what triggered off this sequence. You see the cube lying at the left. Now watch those rings. They will link together and rise to the top and then unlink. Watch the rings carefully. Notice that they have linked. They're now at the top of the box. They've moved to the rear. You'll see them move to the front again. They're out of camera range behind the lock. Now you'll see them come down again and unlink very smoothly. The rings were not broken in any way. This is the end of that sequence. You can see what has happened. The fogging, of course, is due to light leakage on the film, the end of the film. Now, the next sequence, you simply see that some things are simply sitting there, not much is occurring at this point. Notice that the pen has fallen. It is written very rapidly on the paper. Rethink time. Watch what has occurred with the timer. The hand has reversed itself, started out going counterclockwise and abruptly started going clockwise. The message rethink time was significant for that, we believe. You notice also that there's been some disturbance in the coffee grounds and the coffee tray. Pendula are swinging. In this experiment, you see the rings set up, and they're lying in front of the mini-lab at this point. In this experiment, a box has been set in front of the mini-lab to double the chances of something being captured. The mini-lab is in the background. The sealed plastic box with the planchette is shown inside. A ring has moved out of the backward mini-lab. You can see it lying between the two. So we have in effect two mini-labs, one in front of the other here. The planchette holds the pen upright so that markings can be observed, as you notice on the white paper on the base. The box was sealed. Later you'll get to see the pen and planchette move about independently. You can see a matchbook moving inside the box. Moves back and forth almost like an insect. Here the entire box moves. This is one of the less satisfactory experiments because you can see what's happening is happening in front of the box. Now here the box is much too close to the camera. You can see the end of the pen moving, but you can't see all of what's taking place. The camera just does not cover enough territory. But the plastic box is in front of the mini lab. They're both securely sealed. Planchette would often write rather elaborate messages. As an instance, near St. Patrick's Day it wrote, "St. Paddy was an engineer," and drew a shamrock. Here you can see the interior of the mini lab. Now you can see more of the planchette movement. The rings have fallen off of their micro switch and hooked onto the planchette. Notice it drawing. You can see a top view. Cox is panning to show what has happened up to this point in the mini lab and in the plastic box in front of the mini lab. Notice a ring has fallen into the coffee tray, a small flag has fallen over. Cox is pointing out the various things that have happened in this. This sequence, notice the machine is started because the planchette moved slightly away from the micro switch and then stopped. That was a frequent problem. Again, Cox has pointed out the word "think" that has been written on the paper in the back of the mini lab. Nice, pointing out what has occurred, showing how the box has been additionally sealed. Now you can see a small matchbook moving about in the bottom of the box in front of the mini lab. A small toy car is moving about in that box. It's very difficult to observe because it's moving quite close to the bottom of this frame. You can see a slight movement. Now you can see something's all right. You can see that the box shows some motion inside. Now a balloon has inflated inside the mini lab. You see a funny face balloon is moving slightly, although the box is completely sealed. We place the balloon entirely deflated with a string tied around the neck very often on a micro switch, and when it inflated it would trigger the camera. Notice the balloon is moving inside the sealed box. In fact, it's even bouncing a little up toward the top of the box. Now you can see a pen movement. Planchette has moved the pen away from the micro switch. Sometimes weeks or months would pass between activities. Unfortunately, this time the pen had gone dry, so we're not exactly sure what it was writing. Here comes the pen again, although of course we didn't know that it was dry. And this sequence took place shortly after the preceding one. between sequences, either I or some other person, Steve Calvin, Ed Cox, or someone else in the group would reset the switches and rewind the camera, and Cox alone could open the containers. The rest of us simply reset to another micro switch and rewound the camera and got it ready to go again. Here you can see some more of the pen movement. Move slightly off of the micro switch. Notice panning to show what has occurred. Cox is concentrating on the movement of a small target object. Now you can see in this sequence the pen moving away from the micro switch and drawing on the bottom of the box. This was taking place during the summer of 1980, during the first series of experiments. A toy car moving back and forth inside the mini lab. It apported into the box. It's a model of a 1950 Mercury Club coupe. Here's a model which also apported into the box of a Model A. It's moving back and forth almost like it's trying to get out of a tight parking spot, and doubtless that's what set off the camera, was striking the planchette and knocking it off the micro switch. That's why you don't get an actual view of the thing materializing inside the box this time. This happened from outside the box. You can see it back up and strike the micro switch and then proceed forward. Panning shows what had happened. Now we get a view of pen writing in the bottom of the plastic box, swinging about. See the letters being formed. Panning shows what has happened. Now, you can watch the small matchbook go rapidly back and forth, and then it will eventually jump into the air at the beginning of the next sequence.